Okay, great. I will not do the presentation again. So at the top of the hour, you can start your presentation. Okay. So Philip, thank you in name of the Luxo UG and also on the OGB EMEA tour for being here today, speaking with us. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining this session about fighting bad Pl Sql. My name is Philipp Salvisberg. I'm from Switzerland, work there as a consultant, and I'm also the lead developer of the DB Star CodeCop tool suite I'm going to show you today. I just show the free extension to the SQL developer, and I plan to spend more than the half of the session in SQL developer and show you examples how to find bugs and how to identify them and how to resolve them using DB Star CodeCop. But let me give some time for a general introduction into the topic. And my first questions I have is, where is my code I'm going to analyze with DB Star CodeCop? Where do I find it? And it really depends on your architecture. So in this picture, you see a very generic architecture. It's based on Apex, but basically it's possible to put every kind of application into this picture. At the bottom, you see here the database schema, which provides the data, the tables, and so on. And at the top, you see UI components. Those are forms to enter data, reports to show them, to visualize them. And of course, also some client-side processing, which might involve background processing in the database, but can be also solely based on the client side. And also validations is the same stuff there. You can validate on the client side, but also call validations based on the database. So the question is this code in the middle here, where is it placed? Is it placed in the application, or is it placed in the database schema? And of course, you have several options, and I just show them on the next slide here for SQL. In this case, we see a SQL statement, and imagine you can put that in as part of a report in Apex. And this query could be quite complicated. You have some information here about which department you are interested in, so you can add some bind variables, and it works quite well this way. So the whole SQL statement is placed in the application. So imagine you have a second report which is based on the same data, but complete different, same set of data, complete different visualization, maybe some different columns you're querying, but basically the structure of the query is the same. In that case, you have two options. You may just copy the select statement for the different report and adapt it there, or you may decide it to encapsulate the common stuff in one component. And one way to do that is to create the relational view on the database side. So like here, it's shown just as an example, create the view based on depth and emp and some additional tables, cell grade, and something I haven't shown here to cover the common logic. And then I can reduce the logic in my report in Apex to a simplified query, where I just query my columns I want to have. I add some general specific where clause, add an order by, whatever. But the common stuff is stored in a relational view, and my other report is also easier. So I reduce duplicate logic. And for PL SQL, it's similar. You have also processes in Apex as PL SQL blocks. And these blocks can become quite lengthy. You can imagine that it can contain several hundred lines of code. And in this case, also you have the question, where do you maintain that code? At a certain point, it's probably not that good to maintain it in the page designer, even if the editor is nowadays quite good and with syntax highlighting, but it has not that features another IDE on the database side has, for example. So maybe even if you do not think about duplicating code, you think it's maybe better to move the code to the database side. For example, create the PL SQL package in the database for a common update and functionality or common functionality here to calculate the commission for or to get the commission for a certain ID. And then I can reduce the logic and simplify the logic in my Apex application in this case. And of course, this could be any kind of database based application. So what I achieve here when I split this stuff, I extract stuff which I put in the database, in the Apex application to the database. I basically create two components of the application. One is the backend component and one is the front-end component, and both components are addressing different concerns. So the backend developer knows SQL, knows the database well, and can write optimized code, and the UI developer know JavaScript quite well and know Apex quite well and know how to make an application look good and make the end user happy. So that's a way how you separate things. This stuff has a lot of pros and cons, but why I'm going to introduce that in the beginning is that when we do code analysis with a SQL developer, it's much easier if we have the code in PL SQL packages or in views. We also have them probably in files when we're going to deploy them. It's a bit more complicated if the code is stored in the Apex application. It's also in the database, but in the Apex data dictionary, you can grab them and do also some analysis there. But in the end, you have the problem to visualize where is an issue, where I have found it. You would like to open the page designer with the right editor on the right line, on the right column, and that's not that easy. So we don't have tools for that right now. So when you want to check code which you have written in Apex, you can still do that. You just have to copy that in an editor in SQL Developer, and you can do that there. But I suggest to think about moving common stuff to the database. I will come to that topic at the end again. So let's think about software quality. Imagine you are a developer and you are in a team where you have the culture to communicate openly, give open feedback, sometimes even bluntly, and you do reviews before you merge stuff to the main developer branch. So, and sometimes you are a review, sometimes you are the one which code is reviewed, so the roles changes. So the question is, what are the criteria to decide whether this change, this new feature has good quality or not? What are the metrics we are using? And one metric, which is based on a comic, I think in the meantime, it's even a meme, which just says the only valid measurement of code quality is what the fucks per minute. So when you are doing a review and you hear a lot of what the fuck and what the fuck is this and what the fuck is that and how you have written this code and what does this and so on, a lot of this type of comments, then you probably on the right side of this door, behind the right door, and the code is bad you are looking at. But when you don't hear that often, then the code is better and it's actually qualified here as good. And what I really like at this picture is that the good code has also two what the fuck. So it's not absolute zero what the fuck is good code and otherwise it's bad. So there is a range. But how does it help me? So when I look at this code, the developers have experience, what they find good and what they don't find good. And when I'm new, how do I get this information? What is good and what is bad code? So one possibility is to read books about it, or also nowadays just to watch a video. And one of the gurus in this area is, of course, Stephen Feuerstein. And I've added here the link to this video. It's just 8 minutes and worth watching. He just explains his most important 10 tips around Pl Sql. And one of them is, you all know that, maximize the use of SQL, use Pl Sql only when it is necessary, not possible to do that. You know that from Thomas Kite, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of these tips and they're also good, but in the end you think about which one are now binding for my project, how for my product I'm building in these teams. How do I decide that? There are a lot of tips and others are even have other opinions, what is good and bad. And in the end, you have to decide it, what are the measures, the concrete measures for your project or your product. And one way to do that is just to write that down in guidelines. And Trivadis has done that. Actually, Roger Troller was the original author of the Trivadis Pl Sql and SQL coding guidelines, and he released them publicly available as a small booklet, which I still see at some customer sites or saw at some customer sites. I'm not there that much lately, but he has written them and made them publicly available 2009. And when I started at Trivadis in 2000, we also at that time used Roger Troller's templates regarding coding guidelines and adapted them for the needs of the customer. And one thing what Roger mentions here is that code is more often read than written, and this is really important thing. And I think it's completely true. And when code is read more often, then you have to think about every line you write, because if you don't write the line, you don't have to read it, and you don't have to understand it, you don't have to maintain it. So it's important that it's not too short that you don't understand it anymore, but you shouldn't reinvent the wheel and reprogram stuff which is already available somewhere in the database. And therefore, this is an important setting here. So what do we find in the Pl Sql guideline coding, Pl Sql and SQL coding guidelines from Trivardis? So one chapter is just about naming conventions. And when you think about that, they say, my God, naming convention, such a boring topic. And I completely agree, but to a certain extent, it's necessary. And why it is necessary? Because we have objects which share the same namespace. For example, when you write the procedure and you pass a parameter, let's say empno, and this empno is used to query the emp table, and then you have a column which is also called empno, you cannot use the same name for the parameter and for the column name. It's not the same like in Apex, where you use this column before, and therefore it's identified what is a bind variable and what is not. This is not the same. You can use the procedure name, column, and then the parameter name. That's possible, but that's nobody does that. That's lengthy to write and not fun. So in the end, you come up with a scheme where you use a prefix or a suffix to identify a parameter, maybe also the type of the parameters, and then you easily see, oh, that's the column name empno, and that's the parameter empno. And then it goes further. You identify these way also local variables, global variables, and you can do it quite extensively, how Roger has done that, or Trivardis has done that here, or you come up with a much simpler scheme where you just identify parameters, global variables, and local variables, and that's also fine. But in the end, you have to decide how you do that, and you don't want to end up with code which looks always differently because you cannot agree in the team how to write code. Another topic is code style, and I have here an example which is justified. Nobody writes the code this way, but it's just an extreme example. And I showed that to colleagues who said that syntax highlighting is really important to make the code readable. And for me, it does not help really to have syntax highlighting here. What helps is to have it formatted. Now I can much better read it. So it's good to have both, but when I can decide, then formatting code is much more important. Then the code style, of course, defines what are your rules to format the code. What is the intention for the begin here? It's 2 characters. Other projects use 3 or others 4. Are the keywords uppercased or lowercase, and so on and so forth. You have also a big debate because of where you place the comma. Is it trailing? Is it leading? And so on. But these are things which you can usually set up your formatter and define it how you want to have it in your project, and then you press Ctrl F7 and it looks in most cases good. So that's the result of the formatter. And then our other topics part of the guidelines. One also the real rules, and here is an example of a rule which claims that you should use CallEsq instead of NVL when the second parameter is quite costly. I will show you that afterward with a live example, and every of these rules comes with a reasoning and some examples why is it good and bad. And then there are another chapter which I want to mention is the code complexity. When you write code, you want to avoid complex code. But the question is, how do I decide what is complex code? Of course, I can also use this generic metric which says, when I read it, are there a lot of what the fucks when I look at it? Do I understand it? But maybe there are other ways to identify what is complexity. And there are, of course, you can count just the words, the number of lines. You can use the number of paths your code has. That's the cyclomatic complexity, which is shown here. Or you can use the vocabulary used for your code, combine it with cyclomatic complexity, and so on and so forth. There are some metrics which really work, and I used that with code and existing code and customer side, and I was always able to identify the most complex program unit. Sometimes it's number 2 or 1, not the most complex one is always the top, but when you look at the top 3, you identify really the bad ones. So it's a helpful metric when you start looking at the new code base and want to know which code usually the developer try to avoid to change. And this brings us to DB star code cop. And because when I'm calculating stuff like cyclomatic complexity, I don't do that by hand. Maybe I use a checklist and go through the code and say, are the keywords uppercase? Yes, they are uppercase, and so on and so forth, but it takes a lot of time. You want to automate as much as possible nowadays. And DB star code copy is such a suite which helps you. We will look at the SQL developer extension in a moment, but there is more behind. You have also the possibility to integrate it in a continuous integration environment. So basically, when you push something to a branch, it automatically runs your tests. And after that, it also runs your code analysis and shows you where you have introduced new violations. And that's really interesting because you have your technical depth, but when you do a change, it also is able to show you, I know we have these 50 issues, but you introduced these 2 new ones, and you are able to see that. At least you can start and say, hey, I tried to eliminate new issues and we'll work on the old ones when I have time. So that brings us now to the demo, DB star code cop for SQL developer. And what I want to focus here is on bugs. But before I do that, I will go to a generic introduction into the tool and show you what is possible. So let me switch to the SQL developer window. Okay, so here is the example code I've shown before. I can do a right click and do a check, and it gives me some information. I can also show you that this code is really executable. So I get an amount here. This is Oracle does not mind that it is badly formatted, and the code cop does not mind either. What I want to show you here is that I have, when I run a check issues, I will go to that list a bit later. What I want to show you, we have also a reporting tab. I can open that up and make it a bit bigger in SQL Developer. But what I usually do is I open it in a browser. It opens that same report in the browser. It looks a bit neater, and you have the possibility to print it there and so on. It's a bit easier. So you have the information about the analysis of a code editor. That's the editor which was open at that time. And then I have some generic metrics about the whole file. You see the cyclomatic complexity is calculated. You see what is the range, where it is green, where it becomes red, and so on. And then you get a list of the Pl Sql units. In that case, I just have 1. And it has a cyclomatic complexity, which is 4, which is the same as here. And then I get the list of issues. So that's the report. What's also interesting is that I have here a link to the coding guidelines. So I may open these coding guidelines I've shown you before in the slides. We have here several versions. This is the last one with the newest logo. And I may show here the introduction, for example. But on the right side, it's also interesting that you can go to the GitHub page where this stuff is defined. I open that in a new tab. And on this GitHub page, there is the source code available to create this page. So you really can fork this repository and do your changes. The docs are markdown files, for example, for the introduction I showed before. This is the markdown file, so it looks like this, has some special words to make look it a bit nicer here when we go down there, to make it look it a bit nicer. And there are really a lot of people who have, from my point of view, who have already forked that. And one is probably interesting. Insum, it's a consulting company, you know, from in the Apex field. It's based in Canada. They have cloned that, forked that repository, changed some things to match their needs. And that's really a way to come up with your own guidelines. You don't have to rely on the stuff that Predadis provides here. So let's go back again to the code here. And I cannot read that. So let's do the next step and format the code so that it looks a bit better, and we run the check. And one of the checks here I have is, you should try to avoid literals in your code. And that's basically a good advice, but you should try to avoid it. Sometimes it's not really possible, and it doesn't make sense when the literal is just used once. So you get a lot of false positives. As a code checker, you just see here, that's a literal. Is it really good to use the literal? Shouldn't you use a constant here? And this is one of these rules which is really debatable. I don't like it at all. So what I typically do, I go to the preferences for DB star code cop, and I check what was it, 1050, and I'm going to disable that rule. You see here you have other settings. You may write your own validator plugin, which I've done here, and where you put in the plugins for these validators to configure whatever you need. So now I've disabled that, and I shouldn't see that one. Another one, which is also a bit debatable, are you should always label your loops. So somehow it makes sense when I look at the code. I don't know what it does. I could just say it does that. For example, it prints amount hardware in Asia, something like that. Doesn't matter, it's a typo. For the demo, it's okay. And when I do that and I do the check again, then it looks good. So why is that better? You could also use a comment, but when you use such features like code folding, the advantage is that when this for loop is folded here, I still see this information here, and I see where it starts and where it ends. It's debatable. You can disable it when you don't like it. When you think it's something good, then you can enable it. And the next rules I show you are less debatable. From my point of view, from now on, what I show you are rules which, when you see an issue there, this is a bug. Let's start with the first one. In this code, I do a check, and it says here, down here. It says here that both sides of the expression are the same. So I have salary larger 2000 or salary larger 2000. When I read that code, this is one of these what the fuck moments. So was this intentional? Was this just a duplication error? Should there be some other criteria here in the where clause? You aren't sure. It works, it produces a result here. I get the 6 rows, but this line is really not necessary. I can remove it and I get still the same result always. When I do the check right now, then I see, there is no violation. I have another violation a bit lower there, where I see, this variable is not used anymore, but it's somehow related to the next one. Here I have an if on both sides of the expressions. LVAR1 is defined. And it does not make sense, this if. It's not necessary. I can remove it, or maybe I just thought it should be var2. When I do then the check, var2 is used and it's not the same anymore, and it's okay. So it really reveals something which is looks strange and should be addressed and should be changed. Okay. So let's look at the next example. The next example, I start again here with a check. And what does it show me here? It says, oh, I have here a comparison with null and I use an equal. And this doesn't give me a compile error. This code technically works. It compiles, but it does not produce a result for this query, never, because this expression is always false. It should be is null. Of course, and when I do the check again, then it's good. But obviously this is something, and it's interesting when I run the code cop over the whole code base on customer sites, I always find a few cases of that one. But then most one are not reported, and they are not reported like here, because I have also here the equals L commission, but that's a variable and I don't know the value at runtime. Of course, when I read that here, I can calculate it, but maybe this is populated by a procedure call and based on a table or whatever. I have no idea typically what the value is at runtime, and whether this equal is feasible or whether I should handle, and that's the rule about handle null values correctly. So maybe add a commission equal commission, or commission is null, something like that. I don't see that, so you can say it's a false positive, but it's also a good example that there are some rules which identifies a problem, but just because there is a rule checking, it doesn't identify all of them. Let's look at the next one, which is really a bug, also a bug, and it says, I have here a query and this row num is defined in the same subquery as the order by. So the result is for sure not that what I had in mind. Let's look at the example here. When I query it, what it does is it gets the first two rows, whatever the order is in the table, and then it orders them by the salary. It does not mean this is the top two salaries of the table. It's just two of them ordered that way. What you usually would like to do is something like that. You have to rewrite it, put that stuff into a subquery where you get all employees probably ordered by the salary, and then you do an outer query of it where you order that stuff and just where you just get the two top rows. That was a good alternative. We used that until 12.2 came around, which offers us another nice option where we can just say fetch the next two rows, and it has another nice feature where you can say I'd like to have them with ties, so I get them both 3,000 salary rows are ranked as 2, or I can say rows only and I just get the first one. It's good luck or bad luck, however you would like to have it, but that's the option you have. So this is for sure a bug, and you have different options to solve it. Let's look at the other one, the one which I mentioned in the slides. It's about PLSQL and NVL. And it says here, always use PLSQL instead of NVL when this second function is slow. So I run that one. And the result is 14 rows. And it took 2.9 seconds. And why did it took 2.9 seconds? 14 rows 14 times called slow function. The slow function has a sleep of 200 milliseconds and then returns null. So it's unnecessary, this call for 13 times. So when I use here PLSQL, I rerun that, then it's much faster. It's in fact just called once, because PLSQL takes the first not null value. If it's a large list, the first one is taken. So the slow function is only called for king, where the manager number is null, and then it is called. So therefore, it's a bit slower than this 0.2 function. So definitely worth. We have also a second complaint here, and that's here it is saying that you should consider defining your functions as deterministic if possible. Deterministic means that you get always the same result with the same parameter. So this function does not have any parameter, so the first call should identify that the function should always return null. So if I define that as deterministic and run that again, then of course it is fast, but maybe I have to change that to NVL back to show the effect. And you see that it's called just once. Even the slow function is in fact called 14 times, but it's not processed. It just processed once. It caches the result of the null and returns that. So that's the idea of deterministic. But in this case, I think it's not really deterministic. And unfortunately, there is no code in Pl Sql which says it's non-deterministic or something like that. That does not exist, unfortunately, because I would like to have it. In this case, I just say, yes, I checked it. I can say no sonar because I like this, but I want to disable this message here on this line. It's not deterministic, something like that. And when I go back here to PLSQL, copy and paste is something not that easy. Try again. Then this is fast. And when I do a check, then this is okay. So you see another option to disable a line when you think, this check is okay, but in some cases when I have a false positive, I'd like to disable it this way. Okay, so let's look at the next example. This is also a nice bug. This is a copy and paste bug. And because it identifies here that this case expression has a duplication here. It's twice when manager. And in one case, it should return 4,000, in the other case, 9,000. This looks strange. This is also, I call that the what the fuck moment. And what should it be? I can look at the result. In this case, it's easy. And I see our president is missing here with a range. So it's probably should be a president. And when I run it again, then this looks good. And when I run the check again, then there is no code duplication. So this is also helpful. This really happens. And again, when I run these checks on customer code basis, I find some issues there usually. Okay, then the next one is about exceptions. When I run this code, I get an error here. And I have no idea where this error happens. Actually, that's what it is complaining about. Always use format error backtrace that you get an idea where this error happens. So We old school Pl Sql developer usually did something like that before this stuff existed, and disabled code like the exception block like that to identify where the heck is the problem occurring. I run that again, sorry. And then I get the information, oh, it's happening on line 5, actually on 10 and then on line 5. And when I look at the code again, just remove this stuff, then I see, oh, line 10 is this increase cell, and on line 5, this is the update, and actually here it is raising the problem. So I want this information, and to get this information, it's easy. I just have to log the backtrace information when I also log SQL error message or the message itself. It's much more helpful. And when I run that again, then I get the information here. That's the error, and that's the backtrace again on line 5 and 10, the relevant lines. And it does not matter which logging feature you are using. In the end, when you are going to log that, the log should be helpful, and you shouldn't go to the code and disable code to find out where it really happens, because usually you have a lot of code and it's nested and you have no idea where the exception really happened. So this can help you. And especially it can identify the places where you should add it. Good. Let's look at another example. This is something which happens really a lot, because I don't know, up until version 8, whatever, it was not possible to assign a SQL next value to get the next value in Pl Sql directly. You have to use SQL for that. So therefore, there is a lot of code around which does it that way. But nowadays, you can write it like this in pure Pl Sql. Maybe I should just run the check before I fix it, huh? And it says I shouldn't assign it that way. So this error message here happens, and I can reduce the code base, remove 3 lines, solve it with a single line. And the advantage of the single line is that it is also more efficient to calculate the next value than doing it via an access of the dual table, even if the access of the dual table was improved. So now I don't have an issue here anymore. The next example I also like very much, and it's also something which happens a lot in real code and just works because of good luck, I say it that way. So when I run this code, I get 3 rows. And when I call the check, it complains that I should here define the model, what is day, what is month, what is year, when I use the toDate function on both occasions. Why is it that important? Why is it working? Because currently the default NLS format, which is defined in SQL Developer, defines it that way. It's really compatible. That's my format mask. That's all fine. But what happens when I change it to the American format, the one way where we start with the month and then with the day? Does this query work? Yes, it works. It just produces 1 row, a different result. What happens when I change it to the ISO date format? Does it work? No, it does not work anymore because it does not match. It will work when I change it back to the original value, then it produces the expected result. So we are depending on the database settings, or in fact the client settings, that this code works. So this is not really good practice. You should fix that. And a way to fix that is It's like this, you just add here the format for the date, or even better, you just use the date literal, and ISO format is shorter, and it's no performance gain really, but it's shorter. You have also the time literal, which you can use when you have a date time expression. Okay, then the next one is something regarding security. I'm going to delete that one. When I do a check here, it says that this in parameter, it's used here, has not been checked regarding, not asserted regarding SQL injection. And how does it find out that there was used in a SQL? Because this in variable was assigned here to this local variable. This local variable was used here and used in this L SQL variable, and this L SQL variable was used here with execute immediate. You also have these curly lines here that SQL developer is also able to identify this SQL injection vulnerability. So you have the same information with code copy here. So why is it, what's the problem here? Let's look at an example. When I run it, when I execute this code with depth, it's not possible to drop this table. So use drop table with this parameter purge because there's a unique constraint. I use this table for other purposes, so I'm quite happy. When I run it with depth 2, then I get this statement is executed here, drop table depth 2, and it says it does not exist, this table. That's also fine. But what happens here is when I pass depth 3 with a space, then the concatenated, the resulting SQL string looks different, and I get something like an invalid SQL name. The SQL cannot be parsed, and that's the place where you introduce SQL injection. In that case, I can do something like depth cascade constraints, but in other cases, you can do more. And when I run the last example here, then again, it says this thing here does not exist. So how can I assert that? How can I fix that? How can I make that better? I can use dbms assert. Hope that pops up. Yes, and then I have several options. I could say, hey, check that this is a valid SQL name. Can do that like this. Can install that, and when I run that again, it says, yeah, again here I have the error that there is a primary key defined, therefore are used as foreign key also. It's not possible with the depth 2. I get immediately the information, it crashes here, that this is not a valid object. When I pass depth 3, this is not a valid object. When I pass depth 4, this is not a valid object. You see, I can check that, but I can also just check the format. Let's say, I say it's enough when it looks like a valid table. When I run that again, then I get this error message like before. In this case, again, it's executed the statement and finds it out here that this does not work with a valid exception here. But when I pass here depth blank 3, the assert fails because this does not look like a valid table. So when I now check the code, it does not detect vulnerability because I use this assert, or I can define other packages which do the same thing. So that's the idea. But unfortunately, SQL developer still reports that. So now I've come to the last demo. It's one of my favorite hints. I guess all of you are aware what hints are, have used them, and have also debugged them because they were not used. And here is an example which might help you. this check might help you to identify errors when using hints. So what I get here is the first error, fast does not exist. It would be really a nice hint. I would like to have it to make things faster, but unfortunately without tricks, this does not work. And the other issue I have here is never define more than one comment with hints. In fact, I have here the plus and I have here the plus, but just the first one is considered. This one is just comment. That's defined that way. When I run here the SQL and I have the possibility in newer versions to report also hint usages, I unfortunately don't get any information about the hint because it does not know the fast hint, so it's not considered and not reported here that it is not valid. And this is treated like a comment. So I fixed that. I removed that minus here, and you see I can also configure SQL Developer to visualize my hint. So when I place here the plus, then fast becomes red. And when I remove it, the leading becomes red. So this is actually enabled hint. So I do the check again. And when I click here, I do get additional issues. It says this emp, I should use the alias name here, A, and not emp. And for depth, the same thing. This is neither the table name nor the alias. This is really wrong. I should change that. What about reporting of hints in this case? I have to rerun that, sorry. In this case, I get the information U is unused and this leading emp dep is unused. But this explain plan does not get me more information what is wrong here. This I get here, I should use the alias name. So I do that, it's E and it's D. I do the check again. It's okay. Now, does it work the way I want? I check again with the explain plan. This sometimes does not work. So, and I get the information, yes, there is a leading hint applied here. So this really worked and led to a different plan. So that's it about the demoing. I hope you got an impression what you can do with DBStore Code Cop, and that not all rules are silly. Some rule violations are really showing bugs in your code and worth to be applied. So let's come back to a topic I discussed at the beginning. Where is my code again? And I said it's a good idea to move the code from the UI application, be it Java or be it Apex, to the database as a view, as a Pl Sql package, because it has some advantages regarding code checking. But it has also other advantages, and maybe you've heard about SmartDB. It's about running as much as possible within the database, use the database as processing engine, introduce an API where you make sure that your data is consistent. And why is it important that data is consistent? Because like code, data is read more often than written. And to simplify the work for the consumers, the customers of this schema, the data should be provided in a consistent way. It's not really the task of the person who writes the report to do the first step of cleanup, or using everywhere left joins, because you can't be sure if the data exists, if a department exists for an employee. Therefore, you have to use left joins everywhere, and this ends up in not optimal plans, and so on and so forth. So it simplifies the work. And therefore, it's really the responsibility of the writing application to ensure that this data is consistent. And if you are the maintainer of the writing application, you can simplify your life by introducing an API to the user connecting to the database. And the API doesn't have to be something, wow, really complicated. Just make sure that tables cannot be accessed directly. Introduce as first cut the one-to-one view. That's easy, but you have the possibility to change the view when changes are necessary. Introduce a package to do some special calculations or maintenance. This gives you the possibility to optimize the code without deploying the whole UI application. So you get two application components which can be deployed independently, where you have also the possibility to maybe reuse a package and use it as base for a RESTful service, something like that. Consider using SmartDB and Google about SmartDB if you want to find out more about this topic, which is related in my point of view. It's just architectural issues regarding, and the other things we looked at previously are plain Pl Sql issues. So that's it. I'm ready for questions. Used about 54 minutes, so 6 minutes left until the next session starts. So let's look what we have here.
Thank you, Philipp, for your presentation. It was amazing to check those features of the extension, right?
Yeah, thanks.
Really
yes,
impressive.
I hope. And as I said, this DB-Star Code Corp extension is free. You just have to download it and install it in your SQL developer. It's just limited to check the code in an editor. So when you want to do this continuous integration stuff, then you have to license the full suite.
Very nice to know. I will download mine because I am a user of SQL.
I just
SQL
recommend
developer.
try it out, the free stuff, and when you like it, then you can think about using more, and when you don't like it, then it's clear.
Perfect.
Questions? No questions?
No, I think
Have
people
you
are
fallen
too shy
asleep?
today.
Just, yes, I'm here would be nice just to hear something. No?
No. The only
No
question
comment,
I
nothing.
had, yes.
Okay. Good. And if you have questions, you may reach me. I can. You can reach me on Twitter, on LinkedIn, or also on my blog. And on my blog, I have the talk available here. You can download the slides, and there you have further information if you like. Okay.
Perfect.
Good.
Good.
Then if
So,
there are no questions, then I hope you enjoyed it and hope you enjoy the rest of the show.
yeah, I enjoy a lot, and probably the audience too. Thank you very much, Philipp, for your amazing presentation. Name of the Luxo
You're
UG
welcome.
and OGB EMEA tool.
Good. I have to find out where my Zoom window is.
Yeah, I will just stop the
Cannot
recording.
anymore. Just stop it.